Good morning, everyone. We'll get started with BELIV 2022. It's great to see all of you in person. It's hard to imagine that 2 years have gone by since the last iteration that was entirely online in light of COVID. My name is Kyle Hall, and I'll be your session chair for this first session in our keynote talk. I would just say, one person is up here right now, but there's a whole group of individuals that have contributed to make this iteration of BELIV 2022 possible. And, I would just call out my fellow co-organizers, our publicity chair, Sandra, who has done a ton of work. The program committee, I have to admit, I would have loved to have put all of their names up for you, but it is quite a long list. And finally, of course, the steering committee. It really takes a bunch of folks working behind the scenes to make this come together. And a big thank you to all of you for your hard work. And so, just as we get started, an obvious one is, well, what is BELIV? And the best way to tackle this is through a brief history. Now, I would just say that like many great things, the pyramids at Giza and things like that, the actual origins of BELIV have been lost in the sands of time, passed down solely through oral history and such, but I will do my best to recount the tale to you now. So, BELIV, again, another great mystery. How does BELIV map to the full title of the workshop? Evaluation and Beyond Methodological Approaches for Visualization. A non-trivial exercise, really, to get BELIV out of that. But the first BELIV took place in 2006 and was associated with AVI at that time. And it continued to progress. And really at the start, it was focused on evaluation methodologies, emerging techniques in the community, and provided a forum for that discussion. And in 2012, we switched from AVI to Viz. And then in 2018, we moved from being focused on evaluation to also encompassing design methodologies as well. And in this way, it has continued to grow and expand its reach over the years. And it's great to see all of you back in person. And so in terms of 2022, we were thinking, well, where would we take this, right? We started off with evaluation. We then moved on to design. What would be the next step? And as we chatted about this, the other co-organizers and I, what we thought of was, well, really since the last iteration of BELIV, there had been a mountain of change, right? The last time we were together online, it had focused on the question of hybrid and the implications of COVID. And since that time, we have realized many changes to our societies, and many of them actually have benefited and made the whole experience of Viz and connecting across continents more inclusive. A testament to this is the fact that today we have a hybrid conference for Viz, right? We have all of you lovely folks here and the tons of folks online as well. And it is through essentially the crucible of change that was COVID, we actually made this leap forward to realize something that could be better than what we had before. And we are still trying to figure out hybrid, but the point is, it is a progression. And so with that in mind, for 2022, we really wanted to explore this in a more fulsome manner, this idea of what it would mean to design and evaluate visualizations for an ethical, inclusive, and responsible future. And this has only become more needed as we move forward since 2020. Since 2020, there has been a mountain of change, not just with COVID and what came out of that, but also in terms of perhaps the loss of economic and political stability that we had enjoyed before. And with all of these things going on, there's the pressing question of what is it that we as visualization researchers need to do? What should we be thinking about in order to support a better future and work towards that? And so with this focus topic, and building off of the existing historical focus on emerging design and evaluation approaches, we put together a paper call, and then we got a total of 16 paper submissions and accepted 10 papers. And these papers that you'll see today in the subsequent sessions cover both classic research papers that are very much, building off that historical narrative of BELIV, and also position papers speaking directly to this year's focus topic. And so with that in mind, just a very brief overview of how we're going to be tackling this today. Following this morning's session, the welcoming keynote, we'll be really diving into the bread and butter of what BELIV has been to date, evaluation and design methods, and then the first afternoon session. I said BELIV moving forward, but really this is actually looking at Viz more generally and how we move forward, the future. And then our final session will be a series of breakout sessions, both in person and online, dedicated to this year's focus topic. Now, again, we are in a hybrid modality, so what does this mean? Well, to make this as streamlined as possible, we'd ask that you please put all questions on Slido, both in-person and virtual participants, and then the chairs will select questions to ask the speakers. And for clarity, the reason why we're doing this is that essentially we're trying to minimize the switching back and forth between speakers so that we really maximize the amount of time dedicated to questions and getting your questions answered. And finally, the breakout sessions will occur both online and in person, and we'll sort that out as we move forward. Oh. Right. So we are having a bit of a technical glitch with the stream not being online yet. So it's now fallen to me to fill the void of time as we sort this out, I guess. Oh, Casey is here. So the good news is we do have the keynote speaker, so all is not lost. But with that in mind, then I guess we'll move forward trying to sort this out. And I'll introduce our keynote speaker for this iteration of BELIV. So for this iteration of BELIV, we were thinking about the focus topic, this notion of a responsible, ethical, inclusive future. And as we chatted about it as a group, the co-organizers that is, one person really came to the top of our minds, and that's Casey Fiesler. And she'll be giving our keynote in just a moment here. And just for those of you who don't know her, Casey is an associate professor in information science and computer science at the University of Boulder. And she really embodies not only this ethical theme, but also an interdisciplinary theme, holding both a PhD in human-computer interaction from Georgia Tech and a JD from Vanderbilt. Her research and teaching focuses on the areas of technological ethics, internet law and policy, and online communities. Her work on research ethics for data science, ethics, education, and computing, and broadening participation in computing has been supported by the National Science Foundation, and she's a recipient of an NSF Career Award. She also has not only been very active in the research space, but has continued to realize the intersection of research and the public sphere through her frequent engagements as a commentator and speaker. And I have to admit, I was quite impressed to see that we actually have someone who is diving into these technical, ethical areas, but also able to realize and make impacts in the public sphere in things like the New York Times and Teen Vogue. And, you know, if that wasn't enough, she is also really at the bleeding edge with her TikTok videos. And she is very proud of those. And I have to admit, if you have not seen them, you really should take a look. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Casey for her talk this year, Data is People, Research Ethics Beyond Human Subjects. Thank you for joining us, Casey.
Hi, thank you. All right. I have absolutely no idea how many people I'm speaking to right now, so I'm just going to make an assumption based on what makes me most comfortable. Hello, everyone. Sorry I cannot be there in person, but I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you today. And I hope that though what I'm speaking about isn't specific to Viz, that this will provide some provocations and perhaps some questions for you, which I think is one of the most important things when we are thinking about research ethics. So I sometimes joke that as a tech ethics researcher, I just make slides that look like this. over and over until I retire. And I also have been talking to folks about these issues for years and years. The first research ethics workshop that I helped run was at the very end of my PhD in 2014 at CSCW. And this question of like, what does ethics even mean for a researcher? Don't get too excited. I don't have an answer to this question. And in general, I'm afraid I'm not going to give you a lot of answers during this talk, but more things to think about and questions to ask. But sometimes I do know wrong answers. So I will say that a wrong answer to this question is what an ethics review board tells you that you can do. And I will say this is a pretty common way of thinking about research ethics is like, well, did the IRB tell me it was okay? Then it's definitely ethical. Though part of the problem with this is if the IRB or, name your other type of ethics review board in another country doesn't say that it's not okay. We have a double negative here. Does that mean that it's okay? And part of the problem is that particularly in the United States, university IRBs have a very narrow purview. Per federal law, which is why they exist, they cover human subjects research. And human subjects research, and this is a quote from the federal code, means intervening or interacting with people or collecting identifiable private information. I will say the bar for identifiable is actually pretty high here as well. So I'm gonna start with giving you a bunch of examples of public controversies of things that did not fall under the purview of an IRB. So the first one, some folks might have heard about this. Some researchers at University of Minnesota were doing some security research related to the Linux kernel and basically did some bad faith commits to see what would happen. And the consequence of this was that the entire university got banned from contributing to Linux. And there was a paper based on this, and my understanding is that when the paper was reviewed, the reviewers actually asked about whether they had gotten IRB approval, and as a result, they post hoc went to their IRB, and their IRB was like, "Oh, it's fine actually, because this wasn't human subjects research anyway." Another fairly recent example: some researchers at Princeton automated sending a bunch of emails to people who ran websites asking about GDPR and CCPA compliance. So, someone running a mommy blog got an email that was like, "We have this list of questions about how you handle data privacy on your website. Please respond by this date." I actually saw one of these emails because I'm on the legal committee for a nonprofit that runs a website. And we had a whole conversation in our legal committee email list about how we should respond to this email. And my understanding is that some folks who ran small websites and didn't have a lot of resources hired lawyers to ask them if they needed to respond to this email and how they should respond to it. And so there was some actual impact of this study, which was not considered human subjects research. A very recent example at Northeastern, sensors were installed on desks in a lab in order to study desk usage. And the person who did this said that it wasn't human subjects research that required them to go through an IRB because they weren't studying humans directly, they were studying heat. So they were looking at heat signatures on desks to study desk usage. I don't know who was using the desks if it wasn't humans, but another example of something that in this case, I believe the researchers decided should not go under IRB. Another very well-known example is the Facebook emotional contagion study, in which the university IRB that was involved in the study did not review the research because the data was collected by Facebook. And so anonymized data was provided to the researchers. And so therefore it was not considered human subjects data because they didn't collect it, and it was not privately identifiable. And this kind of thing happens fairly frequently when it comes to industry research collaborations. The same thing happened with Dropbox data, and very recently with data that was provided by LinkedIn, which actually looked a lot like the emotional contagion study in terms of how that research happened. So another type of research that is often not considered to fall under the purview of human subjects is public data. These were both examples of public papers that weren't like very widely like named, and I don't like to call out specific researchers, which is why you get my tweets about it as if it wasn't already a public controversy. But in one case here, we had a paper that was published about a community on Twitter, and the people in that Twitter community found out about the paper and got very, very upset about it, in part because it quoted tweets from people who had passed away. Another more recent example, a paper that was published to create machine learning classification for LGBTQ users on Twitter, and exempt from IRB review because it was public data. And this kind of thing happens a lot, right? And we all know about it. We probably all do it. Like, I have done research using public data before. And that's not to say that this is bad. It's not to say that we shouldn't do it. But I want to talk a little bit about how people tend to be making ethical decisions when it comes to use of public data. So this is what I'm going to mostly focus on, because of course, social media data is a goldmine for all kinds of research, including biz research. The first question: how do you decide whether it's okay to collect data? And when I say okay, I mean like, ethical, whatever your, way of thinking about this is. And I talk to people about this a lot, and these are the most common responses that I get. Well, what does the terms of service say? And is the data public? So the terms of service question, myself and some collaborators did a study a few years ago. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study, but here's the takeaway. And this also applies to things like compliance and IRBs and this sort of thing. A reminder: legal and ethical are not the same thing. Sometimes they overlap, not always. So we analyzed the data scraping provision on a very large number of social media platforms. All you need to know for the purposes of this talk is that they're super vague, highly inconsistent, and basically do not cover the kinds of things that you would think would be relevant for an ethical decision. So for example, these data collection provisions tend to be like completely context agnostic. I will tell you the one that I can think of that actually even mentions academic research at all is FetLife. So do not do academic research on FetLife without permission. It's against their terms of service. But they usually don't cover anything about like, what is the data you're collecting? What are you going to do with it? Who are you? What are the expectations of the users? Like all these kinds of things that you would think might matter for an ethical decision are not relevant to terms of service. And the other problem is that basing an ethical decision on terms of service means both that you think that violating terms of service is inherently unethical, and that violating terms of service is the only thing that can make data collection unethical. So is violating terms of service inherently unethical? Some people would say yes. I would say no. One of the reasons that I would say no is because there is a very interesting ethical argument related to being able to study the systems that are impacting society. I use Facebook as an example here because there have been so many conversations about allowing external researchers to study Facebook. And so the question is like, do we only want people who work for, insert social media platform to be able to study its impact on society? People might reasonably disagree about this, and there's a huge tension here, because also if you look at something like the Facebook emotional contagion study, like people were upset about external researchers, being involved in that, or like Cambridge Analytica also involved external researchers. So a huge tension, but I would not say that like breaking terms of service is inherently unethical, because the company could put anything in their terms of service. They could write in their terms of service. And I will say, Parler's terms of service isn't this exactly, but it gets pretty close to like, oh, don't research if you're going to say bad things about us. There's nothing to stop that from being in a terms of service. But of course, terms of service-based decisions also, suggest that it's the only thing that can make data collection unethical, but which hopefully we can all here agree is certainly not the case. And so that brings me to, the other really common way that people tend to talk about, like, oh, whether you collect data or not, which is, well, does the terms of service, is the data public? So public being the magic word here. And an example that always comes to mind for me, it's the OkCupid data set that was released publicly in 2016 without any anonymization at all. And so a number of people, on Twitter pointed out like, oh my gosh, you could like connect real identities to like the answers to highly personal sexual questions from this data set. Like, isn't that a problem? And the researchers said, the data is already public. So therefore it's definitely okay. And this justification for literally anything that involves research with public data is so common that my collaborator, Michael Zemmer, has been writing about this with the exact same phrase. Like, this is exactly what researchers in 2010 said when it came to scraping data from Facebook. And Michael even has like a Google alert for this particular phrase because it's so common. And I would say that like, so I'm going to mention this a little bit later, but like, for example, myself and my collaborators have been studying papers that use Reddit data, and the number of papers where the only discussion of ethics at all, if there's anything, which is pretty rare, is the data was public. Like, that is the ethical discussion. So in 2014, Zeynep Tufekci wrote a paper about social media big data, like a fairly early paper on this topic. And one of the things that she pointed out was that Twitter in particular has the model organism problem. So Twitter is like the fruit fly. We don't study Twitter because it's the best data. We don't like Twitter, it's not like the user base of Twitter is like the most representative user base of everything, right? We use Twitter data because it's easy to study. It's the same reason people study fruit flies, because they're easy to study, because they have short lifespans. Because there's so much research that uses public social media data because it's there. And Twitter in particular, it's really like, it's there. And there's a public API. And this has been true for years and years and years. Like Zeynep wrote this paper in 2014. So my first sort of like foray into thinking about this a lot, my collaborator, Nick Preferis, and I did a study of Twitter users. Basically, like, how do they feel about researchers using their tweets? Like, very basic kind of question. And if you're smart for a moment, like you're thinking, actually, for those of you who are thinking about research methods today, you might be thinking, well, Casey, there's probably some really significant like selection bias for the study. Like people who don't like research probably aren't going to participate in your research study about how they feel about research, which is a very valid critique. And in fact, we're so concerned about that we almost didn't even do the study. But then we're like, you know what? If we do the survey and like the data comes back and everyone's like, oh yeah, research is awesome, I love it. We just won't publish it. Like it just, but that's not what we found. So I actually suspect, like I could speculate that it's probably worse than the findings I'm about to give you in terms of awareness and sort of attitude towards this. So first of all, the majority had no idea that researchers use tweets in research. And I can tell you, like, from like anecdotally, this is true. Like I've been studying this stuff for like 6 or 7 years. And when I talk to people about this research, they're like, wait, scientists are reading my tweets? What? Like maybe there's slightly more awareness than there was like 5 years ago, just because of some, public controversies, but not a lot. This is not common knowledge. And I will tell you, researchers will tell you it is. In fact, years ago, an engineer from Twitter came and gave a talk in my department, and someone asked him the question, like, how do you feel about like, Twitter's business model being based in part on like, like selling data, and API access and stuff to like researchers and marketers and that sort of thing. And he was like, oh, everyone knows. Everyone on Twitter knows all of the people who might be using their tweets. Anyway, that is definitely not the case. Also, almost half of folks thought that researchers this can't be allowed. And most of those thought that it was breaking some kind of ethical rules, and some of them even thought that it must be a violation of Twitter's terms of service, which people don't read. Like Twitter's privacy policy actually tells people that like researchers from universities might be using their tweets. People don't read terms of service. It is not a proxy for things that users are aware of. Also, most people thought that this should not be allowed, and for a lot of different kinds of reasons, which actually the point of the study was not like to determine, is Twitter research ethical or unethical? Like, I do not have tenure at the time. I was not going to write a paper telling people they can't use tweets in research. I still wouldn't do that, though. That's not the point. The point is, what are the things that matter when it comes to people's levels of comfort? What are the kinds of things that you might do to mitigate potential harms? And so I don't expect you to get meaning out of this table, but the point of this is that there are contextual factors that matter, right? So people's level of comfort is affected by things like how the data is analyzed and how much data there is and what part of your Twitter it is and whether it's quoted in the paper and these kinds of things. Because these things matter. Like, what's the data? What are you going to do with it? Who are you? What are people's expectations? And all of these things are more than is the data public. I guess the way I would put it is that publicness is a floor, not a ceiling, right? Like, probably don't study not public data. Like, don't go on to, a private Facebook group and use their data. But once you pass that bar, there are a lot of other things you should be thinking about as well. And that's some of the provocation I'm trying to provide today. So one part of this is, and based on the title of my talk, data isn't just data. If it comes from people, this isn't just numbers. It's not just words. These represent real, actual humans. Maybe it's not human subjects research by the definition of an IRB, but it still comes from people. And it's not all the same. So for example, a tweet about what someone had for breakfast. There's lots of these. This came from the first talk that I gave like this in 2018. It was probably on September 20th. 2018. I'm on Twitter. And I'm like, okay, let me find a tweet about what someone had for breakfast. And then I decided to find another kind of tweet to contrast. So this is paraphrased because why would I even need to put this on a slide? Someone tweeting about being HIV positive. These two things are not equivalent, right? The idea that you would treat these two pieces of content completely the same ethically is absurd. And if you literally your only ethical heuristic is it public or not, then these two things are equivalent. And there's nothing to stop you from, quoting the second tweet in a paper or finding the person who tweeted it and tying it to their voter registration data or something like that. And there's a lot of health-related research happening from Twitter. So this paper from 2018, they found that 72% of PubMed articles that use Twitter data, so medical health-related articles, quoted at least one tweet, and those led back to the Twitter user 84% of the time. So if I had given you that actual tweet, you could have put it into the search bar of Twitter and found that Twitter user where they might have provided more information about themselves. And of course, Twitter isn't the only place where we're seeing a lot of research, some of which is in quite sensitive contexts. For example, this was in a paper about creating an algorithm that could predict BMI from photos of faces. And where do you think you get photos of faces mapped to BMI, like a very large data set? A weight loss support community on Reddit. So imagine that like you are like making yourself vulnerable to like post about your weight loss journey in a public forum so that you can like help and support other people, and then find out that your photo is in a scientific paper, and without permission. And I would say actually Reddit is interesting because like maybe more of the fruit fly even now than Twitter was in 2014. And actually my collaborators and I published a paper last year based on an analysis of over 700 Reddit papers. And these cover like, these are not papers about Reddit. They're papers, some of them were, but like papers that use Reddit data. Huge variety of fields, lots of social science research, and like the most common or some of the most common topics are mental health, depression, a lot of addiction, these kinds of topics that perhaps it actually might be kind of difficult to study, to get people to talk to you about these kinds of things, and this huge amount of research based on this like public trace data. Also, on the topic of like vulnerable communities, there was also the HRT data set, the researchers who took videos from YouTube of people going through gender transition in order to train facial recognition. And when this came out, people who were in these data sets were upset. Someone whose transition photos appeared in a scientific paper wasn't told about it, felt like it was a real violation of privacy. And people also were like, is my video that I made to help my community, like, being used to potentially help build technology that could actively harm us, that's pretty upsetting. And again, without any kind of consent, and people are often upset to find out that they were studied. And actually, if you think back to the Facebook emotional contagion study, if you're not familiar with it, the basic idea was that news feeds were tweaked to show people more or less positive or negative content, and then their content afterward was analyzed to see whether it changed. So, like testing whether the psychological phenomenon of emotional contagion happens on social media. And there was this huge outcry about, the first headline was like, emotional contagion happens on Facebook. And then the next headline for like, Facebook is manipulating you to make you sad. It was the reaction to it. Some of the like media portrayals of it was a little bit overblown, in my opinion, in terms of what actually happened, in part because it didn't necessarily explain the study very well. But people were very upset about it. And so some collaborators and I did a study where we looked at public reactions to this study via comments on news articles, which is a kind of public data. So I use public data in my research as well. And I will say I wrote about like 2 paragraphs in this paper about my ethical considerations in doing this research. And so what was upsetting to people about it? Well, there were a lot of answers to this, but part of it was just like people being upset that they were being experimented on without knowing. I'm not on Facebook to be in a petri dish, and you'll see a lot like justifications for this kind of thing. Like, well, it's in the terms of service. It is. Maybe people should read the terms of service more. They don't necessarily. But people can be upset, not even just about the consenting, but sometimes the informing. So inform and consent do not always have to be paired. Sometimes people can be told about things, even if they don't provide consent ahead of time. So for example, again, on the topic of Reddit, r/drugs has it might not still be there, but had a pinned post that was like, hey, all you researchers who are studying this subreddit, can you at least give us a heads up? And so they're like, and they actually say here, like, we know we can't make you do this, but like, we think this is the right thing to do ethically. You should at least tell the moderators when you're going to scrape our data. Also in the Twitter study that we did, I thought this was an interesting finding. 80% of the people we surveyed said they would want to be told that their tweet was in a research study, and 83% of them said they'd want to read the paper. Like, if your tweet, I mean, it's kind of interesting, right? Like, I'm part of a research study. Why would I not want to know about that? There are some nuances to this, right? Like, there's a lot of research about arguably like negative kinds of communities or antisocial kinds of communities, or even things where the researcher could be put in danger. Lots of people studying disinformation or the far right or these kinds of things. And I think that is a really important nuance to take into account. And one of the things we're going to talk about is also thinking about the benefits of research versus the potential harms. One kind of potential harm, though, has to do with amplification and archiving of content. So, for example, a number of years ago, there was this paper that was about like what happens to people's language on Twitter after they get engaged, like very innocuous subject matter. And the paper had a code book in it, which is very common. Like, here are some examples of how we coded things. And there was a New York Times article about this research study, and the the journalist like took these tweets and put them into Twitter and found them, and then like contacted the people who tweeted them, were like, hey, your tweet was in this research paper, can we talk about it? And like, fine, no harm done, right? You know, a tweet about fishing, whatever. But what if instead of a tweet about fishing, that had been a tweet about someone's HIV status? Or what if it was one of the, you know, mini studies we have about like predictive health on social media? So it was a journalist calling you up and saying, hey, your tweet was used as an example in this paper. This algorithm says that you are very depressed. Can we talk about it? Like, that could be incredibly harmful. And you know, I like to think a journalist wouldn't do that. But you know, for the researchers, or even, you know, potentially the journalists, I'm not sure what their codes of ethics say about this kind of thing. But like, if the only ethical heuristic is it public, then that doesn't suggest you should do anything different. We've done a few research studies in my lab about people from different marginalized groups, about how they feel about research of their public data. And in one study where we talked to mostly queer people, a lot of people were concerned about their content being taken from the context where it was and put in other places, or like being amplified, potentially putting their privacy and safety at risk. Like, you know, I put my stuff here on Tumblr, and yes, I know that it's public intellectually, but I don't want the entire audience of BuzzFeed to see it, or, you know, to be in an article that could potentially put me at risk if my privacy is violated. And then there's this additional concern there of like researchers coming into this community and just like taking data and not giving anything back to the community, and not like just parachuting in, like, let's take some data, and not taking the time to understand it or to give anything back. And one of my other PhD students, Shamika, spoke to people who are on Black Twitter about the same kind of issue. And we saw very similar kinds of concerns. So for example, when researchers scraped the Black and the Ivory hashtag, people were pretty upset about this. And some of these things do have to do with positionality, because there is a difference between someone who is part of Black Twitter, or, you know, a Black researcher going into this community and doing research, and like a white researcher doing a study on Black Twitter without talking to anyone. And we talk a lot about positionality when it comes to like sort of traditional human subject research, like, oh, what's your rapport going to be like with your interview subjects or whatever. We don't talk as much about it when it comes to like data science, or you know, big data, like trace data kind of analysis, which arguably should be a bigger deal. Because like, at least if you're interviewing someone, like if you're talking to someone, you're like hearing about their experience. But what if you just like go into a community that you're not a part of and you don't understand, and you just, you know, interpret their data without even talking to someone? And again, there might also be this sense of like, you know, researchers imposing themselves and taking data without giving anything back, but also the potential for actively harming a potential community. And this kind of thing has come up a lot with facial recognition research. You know, there was a lot of controversy around the study where they determined that off-the-shelf facial recognition algorithms could predict whether someone was gay or straight from a photograph, and the photographs that they used from that were from dating sites. Which, you know, where do you get photos labeled as someone's sexual orientation without asking for permission? Dating site. And this kind of research as well, it's not even just like, where are you getting the data from, or do you ask permission, or that sort of thing, but also, what are you going to do with it? Like, the idea that what you're going to do with it doesn't matter is also kind of absurd. And we often think like, oh, well, you know, it's just research. It's just for science. And if you're thinking about like facial recognition or facial analysis research in particular, if you get to something like automated criminality inference, I mean, I have to say, when it comes to like research ethics examples, this tends to be my go-to for like why. I struggle with any reasonable justification for this research personally. But I will say that the researchers in this case, after there was a big outcry about it, wrote a sort of response, and their justification was for science. Like we wanted to see if we could. And we wanted to see if we can be a reasonable benefit for research if there aren't any harms. But as soon as you start thinking about research that could actually have like real world impact and actual harms, there needs to be more of a benefit than we wanted to see if we could. And this kind of research can lead to real world kinds of things. Like people are using facial recognition for things like hiring or fraud detection, or these sorts of things. So this brings me to another issue with like this sort of human subjects framing for research ethics, particularly in the United States. Happy Halloween. What if Victor Frankenstein had to get IRB approval? Was the topic of this paper published a few years ago. So they like did like a fake IRB for Frankenstein and talked about like what it would have been like. But one of the things they said was that if Dr. Frankenstein had to get an IRB before he like made his monster, he would have had to think about unintended consequences. And like that's actually not necessarily the case. So some of my collaborators and I recently published a paper. It's a design fiction, actually, that is it's written as a fake IRB determination for a postdoc study. It was a little bit inspired by like the University of Minnesota Linux thing. The idea here is that public data is used and all of these bad things happen. There's all of these like downstream consequences, and there's this big controversy, and the IRB is brought in and they were like, yeah, this was bad, but it's not human subjects research. And part of the reason for this as well, beyond like just the definition of human subjects, also IRBs very explicitly do not consider long range effects. They don't do downstream consequences. That is not what they do. And yet, this is obviously a big deal, and it's a huge topic of conversation in computer science right now, like broader impacts, unintended consequences, et cetera. So like, NeurIPS requiring broader impact statements, which include like future societal consequences. And these are really important for us to be thinking about. There are all kinds of possible consequences of research that aren't, are you getting someone's consent, or are you going to violate someone's privacy? Like, the kinds of things that we tend to think about for human subjects research. IRBs do often think about individual harms, like privacy violations, but not downstream harms. We also need to be thinking about impacts on communities and impacts on science. Like, we are in a world right now where public trust in science is under attack, and researchers doing unethical things absolutely impact that. We have a huge responsibility to not do more to undermine trust in science. And of course, we also need to be thinking about like impacts on large societal structures, and even things like bad actors, unintended uses of our research. So this is something, this kind of speculation and thinking about unintended consequences is something that we've been thinking a lot about in my research lab. This is part of the focus of my career grant. And we've been talking about it in terms of ethical debt. So like technical debt, but the idea being that instead of like the cost of future bug fixes. Like what are the implied costs of not thinking through the possible societal ethical implications, like while you're designing the technology or while you're designing the research, and instead of waiting to see what happens? Because at that point, the harm is already done, right? And I do actually think that in this sense, it's important for people to be thinking about things that might happen. Now, we can't see the future, but we can speculate. And I'm reminded of this quote from Isaac Asimov about how science fiction writers foresee the inevitable, but that solutions are not as inevitable as the catastrophes are. And it doesn't tend to be the job of science fiction writers to think about the solutions, but it does tend to be our job to think about the solution. So sometimes maybe we should be thinking a little more like science fiction writers. And by that, I don't mean like, oh, let's like spend all our time imagining the ethical implications of some technology that someone might create in 50 years. But if you can do that, you should be able to do the same thing with the technology that you are creating tomorrow. Right? Like if you can figure out how to think through like fun Black Mirror, like future stuff, then like, why can't you do that with your research project? Someone who worked with Facebook told me that today, these days, they make them think about potential news headlines. I've had my students do this before. I'm like, imagine, like, what's the worst possible headline that someone could write about that? Like, what is the worst possible interpretation of the research that you're doing? And I think that's good for us to be thinking about. So I have a teaching exercise that's based on Black Mirror, with the idea of like cultivating this kind of skill. And I interviewed Shamika and I interviewed a bunch of professors who use this in their classes. And one of the most interesting findings out of this was someone talking about the pitfalls of using this kind of speculation, because people tend to lean on their own experiences so strongly that they often don't think about potential harms to other kinds of people. So like if you have a classroom full of like middle-class white men, then they're going to think about harms to middle-class white men, which does not tend to be the majority of like technological harms, right? I have thought about this sometimes in the context of thinking about designing technologies, but I think this is just as true for thinking about research. So for example, the book Design Justice quotes this tweet about the social media platform Ello. Because they didn't have any mechanisms for like dealing with harassment when the platform was launched. Like you couldn't block people, and this tweet was like, if your network doesn't allow blocking abusers from the jump, it was probably developed by white dudes. Because who's really good at imagining how technology might be used to harass people? People who get harassed a lot, like women and people of color and queer people. And you're just like naming off groups that are underrepresented in the tech industry. And, when I saw this, I was actually thinking of an op-ed that I saw that was published, I think in 2014, written by Don Norman. I'm imagining a lot of you are familiar with the design of everyday things. So Don Norman wrote this op-ed that said, I wrote the book on user-friendly design, but what I see today horrifies me. So what do you think it is that horrifies Don Norman? Like, what is the thing that is worse designed now than when he wrote the design of everyday things? And the answer is, the world is not designed for the elderly, which is very true. But is it less designed for the elderly than it was then? No, it was just as bad then. The world has not changed. Don Norman has changed. And it is easier for us to understand potential harms when it is harming us. Like, that's just the truth. And so it's also really important to keep in mind when we are thinking about the potential harms of research, that we're not thinking only about, oh, how would that affect me or my research team? So I wanted to add. So I have one last slide. I couldn't figure out where to fit this into the talk, but I wanted to leave you with some actionable things. So I mentioned that my collaborators and I did a study of papers that used Reddit data. And out of these 700 papers, only about 150 of them, or less than that actually, included any discussion of ethics at all. And of those, a pretty large number of those just said like the data was public. But there were some really good examples of good ethical discussions in these papers where people talked about things like going beyond IRB requirements, of course. They talked about engaging with community gatekeepers, like talking to moderators in a community, even if they weren't getting individual consent. They talked about taking particular care for vulnerable communities and sensitive topics. There was discussion of obfuscating data, like ethical fabrication. So if you're going to quote something, maybe you shouldn't be able to lead back to that person. So you can obscure the quote so that it can't be Googled, for example. Limiting access to data. So like, I recognize the significant tension here with open science, and I don't know all of the solutions to this, but I do worry sometimes about public data sets with data that is created by humans, because it creates an archive of something so that it no longer gives people control over that data, so they can't delete it, for example. One possible solution to this is limiting the access to data. So providing data sets by request, for example, so that you can vet how someone's going to use it. And of course, talking about weighing risk versus benefits, including what are there benefits? Like, how often do we actually explain what the benefits are, particularly to the community that you're studying? And then also, again, consideration for researcher positionality, which can matter when you're analyzing trace data. And so I will leave you with 3 questions. So one, what are the potential harms or negative impacts of a piece of research, which, you don't have to have a crystal ball. We can also learn from the past and past examples. What can be done to mitigate those potential harms? And then, is there benefit to this research, and who does it benefit? So, for example, are the potential harms to this community, but the benefits only to you? Is the only benefit of this I get a paper publication? So, I think that these are really important things for us to be thinking about. And as always, a note that I like to end on, which is that we critique the things we love. I think that, there are some ethical, research ethics issues, sort of pervasive throughout computer science, but that a lot of people really want to know how to think through these things and to do the best that we possibly can. And so one of the best things that you can do as a researcher is to talk about these things publicly and in your communities, and write about it in your papers. Like, if we all wrote more about our ethical decision making in our papers, that's how we learn from each other as well. And so I will leave it with that, and hopefully there's time for questions.
Thank you for that great talk, Casey. That was really fantastic. And we have oodles of questions on Slido, so I'll try to paraphrase them and kind of group them together, but please do take a look, and please do continue to post, folks. So maybe one of the recurring themes that appeared here was the question around, isn't conducting ethical research considered to be a factor to the validity or rigor of the research, especially in qualitative studies? Why is this perspective not discussed much, and ethics is seen as something separate from rigor or validity of research? And by extension, another person was then kind of picking up on that and asking, well, shouldn't we be including these ethical considerations in the peer review process, and what would it look like to do so?
Wonderful point. I completely agree with you. I have my other soapbox is about ethics education, and how, one way for us to stop seeing ethics as some kind of specialization that is for other people to think about is for us to be teaching ethics as part of every research methods class that someone takes should have ethics is part of doing good research. If your research is unethical, it's bad research. It's just bad. I think that if that were a more pervasive attitude, we'd be in a much better position. But I will say, I think that a lot of unethical or ethically questionable things that happen are, tend to be lack of foresight or not really knowing the kinds of things to think about, which is the other reason why education can really help. So I guess this kind of goes to my last point, which is that we should be writing about this stuff in our papers more. And it is a part of the peer review process. So I'm the chair of the ACM SIGCHI Research Ethics Committee, and we basically come in during peer review when requested. So basically the idea is if ethical concerns of the paper arise during the review process, the meta reviewer can contact us and say, "Hey, can we get an opinion on this?" And it's sort of like bringing in a 3AC with ethics knowledge. We don't say whether papers should be accepted or rejected. We're not evaluating. It's here's what we know. Here's what we think about what happened here and what we know about the norms of the community, and then let them do what they will. And most of the time, or rather, the most common outcome when this happens is the authors are asked to explain something in their paper. I haven't seen much inherently unethical research. It tends to be that things aren't explained well. And we don't tend to write a lot about our ethical decision making, but this is how we learn from each other. My students and I just had a paper accepted to SIGC where we surveyed people who teach computing classes about whether they include ethics in their classes, if they teach technical classes. And one of the findings was that people are more likely to include ethics in their classes if they feel that they have a community with which they can talk about ethics. And I think that professional communities are actually a really important part of that. So we should be having more conversations like this. This is how we learn from each other. I think that the whole that point, that it's not good rigorous research if it has ethical flaws, is an attitude that I would like to see in a way that helps people do better research. That's not just entirely based on punishing them for doing bad things, even if it was unintended.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's very true, what you were saying there. Just as a follow-up question then, thinking about the fact we have an international community here, how do we tackle the issue of that ethical standards vary with society, and by extension, they also evolve with time, so they're not just fixed things? Any particular thoughts there?
Yeah, it is actually really challenging to come up with specific ethical guidelines, in part for this reason, because it's so context dependent. I do think that a research community could decide on standards. Realizing though that there might be different norms and different types of methodological education, et cetera, in different disciplines and different parts of the world, which is why I think that we should also be this should be a learning opportunity for people. But yeah, that is a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge in any context. People don't inherently have the same sort of ethical intuitions. But I think that the more a research community has conversations about this kind of thing, the more that you can converge. But for this reason, SIGCHI in particular has been very reluctant to create explicit ethical guidelines, in part for this reason. And so everything is sort of case by case basis, context dependent. And you'll notice again, I didn't really again, the talk that I just gave was about the kinds of questions you might ask, the kinds of things you might think about and speculate about. It wasn't don't do this and don't do this, because it's all very context dependent, which I recognize is very challenging for a lot of people. And there's a reason why there's been research that shows computer scientists tend to lean towards utilitarianism when it comes to ethical frameworks. And I think part of the reason for that is it's the closest we can do to turning ethics into math. But even if you're the most good, the least harm, what most good and least harm means is very hard to determine. And also most good for whom, least good for whom. This is really, really hard. And people are gonna make mistakes. But the more people who are actually thinking about it, the better position we're gonna be in.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Just building on what you were talking about, all of this stuff about the considerations of using public data sets, and, public is not to say it's ethical. One of the questions that was raised on Slido was the fact that in visualization, we're often working with different domains, different groups of researchers who bring data to us. So we're not actually the primary data collectors or doing the analysis. We're really supporting those individuals. So how do we engage in ethical conversations with those folks when we're doing essentially work that may be potentially based on data that is of questionable provenance?
This question comes up sometimes in the context of hacked data or deleted data or that sort of thing. Is it okay for me to do research on the Ashley Madison data set? And I've seen people disagree about that. My initial response to that question is you should have a conversation about where this data came from and whether it was collected ethically and that kind of thing. I guess you could argue well, if I don't do it, someone else is going to. But if something is ethically questionable, you should talk to them about it, because they might not realize, they may not have thought about it. But B, you don't want your name attached to something that, potentially caused harm or is, for whatever reason, ethically questionable. And I get, the incentive structures in academia are really messed up sometimes. And it can be hard to be don't analyze this data or turn down this, potential for a publication. But I think that it's really we can do things as individuals. And I think that it's worth having that discussion with someone and potentially just saying no if it actually is a problem.
So we're coming to the end of our time here, but maybe a couple more questions. Perhaps a deceptively simple one. Is soliciting consent sufficient for addressing the ethical challenges you have been describing?
For some of them, it could be. But also, I will say that, I don't actually want to suggest that consent is always appropriate or always needed. Because that would basically just mean no more Twitter research. And again, I'm not going to say that. I think that there are ways to do this ethically and to think about mitigating harm and that kind of thing. And also, again, if you're studying like a community that could potentially cause harm to the researcher, or like, if you're studying like, I don't know, like a subreddit of incels, you're not going to be like, okay, I'm gonna write a paper about you. Can I get every, like, of course they're not going to consent. But that's when like you need to think about the harms and the benefit to the research. And also in that case, there are also contexts in which you should be considering harms to researchers, particularly students. So I do think that consent isn't like, the be all of ethics, but it can be helpful in some contexts. One like example of a sort of middle ground is if you're doing a research study where, like, let's say you're studying trace data and you're going to use quotes in a paper, you could just get permission from the people that you're quoting, and not everyone in the data set, would be, or like if you're creating a visualization of like tweets or something and there's going to be like, it's going to show tweets, you could get permission for certain kinds of ways that it might point to individual ones or something like that. I think that there are a lot of different kinds of possibilities, and it's just so highly contextual and case by case.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much, Casey. It has been a fantastic talk and much appreciated. Hope you have a lovely day. Thank you again.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me, and folks are welcome to reach out or tweet at me or whatever if they want to talk more.
Thank you. And we'll be coming back together at 10:45 after the coffee break.